There is a particular kind of loneliness that has no name in polite conversation. It doesn't arrive because you are excluded. It doesn't come from being forgotten or overlooked or left behind. It arrives because you began to see, really see, and once that happened, the world you thought you understood started to look like a stage. And you started to realize you had been one of the actors all along, reciting lines you never chose, playing a character you never auditioned for, receiving applause for a performance you were never entirely sure was yours. Most people spend their entire lives chasing belonging. They shift their opinions based on the room they're in. They laugh at jokes they don't find funny. They stay quiet when they should speak, and speak when they know they should stay quiet. They dress for the group, eat for the image, and love in the way that earns them the most applause. And for a long time, sometimes for decades, this works. The approval flows in, the invitations come, the group holds them close. But then something happens. It could be a single moment, a betrayal so small they can barely name it. A conversation that ends with a strange, hollow feeling in the chest. A gathering they attended, surrounded by people they've known for years, where they looked around the room and felt completely, profoundly alone. Not sad, not angry, just aware. Aware that something in the room was being performed, that the laughter was slightly too loud, that the warmth was slightly too efficient, that every person there, including themselves, was playing a role they had been rehearsing since childhood. And once they noticed it, they couldn't unnotice it. Carl Jung called this the beginning of a psychological crisis, not in the clinical sense, but in the ancient Greek sense. Crisis meaning a turning point, a moment when what once sustained you no longer can. Jung believed that most people reach this turning point somewhere in midlife, though it can arrive much earlier or much later. It arrives when the ego, the constructed self, the mask you built for the world, can no longer hold. When the gap between who you truly are and who you've been performing becomes too wide to ignore. And the first symptom of that gap is silence. Not the comfortable silence of someone at peace, the restless, aching silence of someone who has started noticing too much, who hears the subtext beneath the words, who observes the subtle politics of every social exchange, who finds that small talk doesn't feel small anymore. It feels like suffocation, like you are slowly drowning in the shallow end of the pool while everyone around you splashes happily and wonders why you're not having fun. That silence is not depression. It is not social anxiety. It is not misanthropy. It is the first tremor of something much deeper, something that, if you follow it honestly, if you resist the enormous pressure to return to the comfortable noise, will take you somewhere most people will never go. It will take you to yourself. Drop 11. I am awakening to my truest self in the comments right now. Jung gave a name to the identity we construct for the world. He called it the persona, borrowed from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in ancient theater. The persona is not entirely false. It is not a lie. It is a necessary interface between your inner world and the demands of social life. You need it to function. You need to know how to conduct yourself in a job interview, how to carry yourself at a funeral, how to be appropriate in a room full of strangers. The persona smooths the rough edges of the psyche and makes coexistence possible. But here is where things go wrong. For most people, the persona doesn't stay where it belongs. It doesn't remain a tool you pick up and set down. Slowly, gradually, through thousands of tiny social negotiations beginning in childhood, it fuses to the skin. It becomes the answer to the question, "Who am I?" And by the time most people are adults, they have forgotten that the mask and the face are two different things. Think about how this begins. A child is born with a full emotional range. She cries when she is sad. She screams when she is angry. She laughs until she can't breathe. She tells the truth with a directness that adults find alternately charming and alarming. And then the conditioning begins. Not maliciously, not consciously, just through the ordinary mechanisms of social approval. Don't be so sensitive. Stop being so dramatic. Be nice. Stop showing off. Smile. Settle down. What will people think? Every one of those corrections is a deposit into the shadow. Jung's term for the psychological container where everything that cannot be socially acceptable gets stored. The aggression goes into the shadow, the ambition goes in, the grief goes in, the hunger for something more goes in. The parts of the personality that feel too large, too strange, too raw, too honest, they all get folded down and sealed away, because belonging felt more urgent than being whole. And this trade feels reasonable for a very long time, until it doesn't. Until something fractures the illusion and you realize, with a clarity that hits like cold water, that the people you've been performing for have been performing just as intensely for you. That your relationships have not been exchanges between two real people. They've been exchanges between two masks. That the intimacy you believed you had was conditional on both of you maintaining the act. And the moment one of you slips, the moment one of you says something too true, feels something too visibly, or simply stops pretending for one unguarded second, the whole arrangement trembles. Write 444. I trust the depths of my own becoming below. This is the moment the withdrawal begins. Not with a declaration, not with confrontation, with a quiet, internal pulling back. A growing reluctance to explain yourself to people who weren't actually listening. A diminishing appetite for the social rituals that once felt natural. A creeping recognition that the energy required to sustain the performance isn't worth what it purchases. From the outside, it looks like you're pulling away from people. From the inside, it feels like you're finally pulling toward yourself. Here is something Jung understood that most of us resist for as long as we possibly can. The qualities you are most certain you don't possess are the qualities you are most urgently being asked to confront. The things that make you furious in other people are almost always the things you refuse to acknowledge in yourself. The colleague whose arrogance drives you to distraction. The friend whose neediness exhausts you. The public figure whose dishonesty fills you with contempt. Jung would look at every one of those reactions and say, "Look closer." Not because they aren't arrogant or needy or dishonest. They may be all of those things, but the charge, the particular heat of your reaction, the way it lingers, the way it activates something primal in you, belongs to you. That is your shadow knocking. The shadow is not evil. That is perhaps the most essential thing to understand about it. The shadow is exiled potential. It is the anger that could have been healthy assertiveness, buried because assertiveness wasn't safe in your household growing up. It is the ambition that could have driven something meaningful, suppressed because standing out felt dangerous. It is the grief that needed expression, packed away because falling apart wasn't permitted. It is the raw, unedited self that existed before the world had its way with you. And the shadow does not vanish because we bury it. Jung's entire career was a documentation of what unfolds when we don't. The buried shadow doesn't disappear. It emigrates. It surfaces in our relationships as irrational jealousy, as sudden eruptions of rage that seem disproportionate to what provoked them, as the unconscious dismantling of things we claim to want. It appears in the groups we belong to as the collective shadow is projected outward, onto enemies, onto outsiders, onto anyone different enough to serve as a screen. History is, in many ways, a chronicle of what happens when the collective shadow goes unexamined. But individuation, Jung's word for the process of becoming psychologically whole, begins when a person stops outsourcing their shadow. When they start examining what lives inside them with the same unflinching honesty they've been directing at everyone else. When they stop asking what is wrong with the world and start asking what is unresolved in me. Not in a self-punishing way, in a genuinely curious one. This is demanding work. It requires sitting with things about yourself that are deeply uncomfortable, recognizing the ways you manipulate, the ways you perform, the ways you have used people for validation, for comfort, for a sense of identity. The ways you have been less than honest, less than kind, less than the person you present yourself as. Not to condemn yourself, to integrate, to bring those buried parts back into the light and give them their rightful place in the full architecture of who you are. Comment 528. I am healing from the inside out right now. And here is the paradox. The moment you begin to own your shadow, you stop projecting it onto others. And when you stop projecting it onto others, something remarkable happens. People become far less threatening and far less compelling as objects of your judgment. You start seeing them clearly, not as heroes or villains, not as saviors or persecutors, but as human beings doing what human beings do, protecting themselves, seeking connection, navigating their own buried shadows as best they know how. The contempt softens. The idealization dissolves. What remains is something quieter, a clear-eyed, patient compassion that has no need to be performed. That is the gift of shadow work. But it arrives at a social cost, because when you stop participating in projection, you step outside the invisible economy of most social groups. And the invisible economy does not quietly release you. The withdrawal happens gradually. It rarely announces itself. One day you notice you've been declining more invitations than you've been accepting, not because you're withdrawn,
because the events you're declining would require you to perform a version of yourself you're no longer willing to perform, because the conversations you'd encounter there would orbit the same surface-level topics that once felt comfortable and now feel like a particular kind of slow suffocation. One day you realize you've stopped over-explaining yourself, that when someone misunderstands you, you let the misunderstanding stand instead of rushing to correct it, because you've begun to sense, quietly but clearly, that some people's understanding of you was never meant to be accurate, that they require you to be a particular thing, and any information that challenges that requirement will simply be filtered out. So you stop offering material for a conflict you didn't create and never agreed to enter. One day you discover that your tolerance for dishonesty, even the small social kind, the comfortable distortions that make interactions smooth, has dissolved. Not in a self-righteous way, not in a way that makes you want to confront people publicly or lecture anyone, just in a way that makes participating in it feel physically draining, like your whole system is rejecting it. These are not signs of damage, they are signs of discernment, but the world will not perceive them that way. The social world most of us inhabit has a very specific set of responses for people who begin operating outside the standard range of social transaction. First comes the attempt to draw you back in. Humor, nicknames, invitations, the gentle social pressure of, "Come on, don't be like that." This is not malicious, it is instinctive. Social groups regulate themselves. They maintain equilibrium. And a member who begins behaving unpredictably, who stops fulfilling their expected role, who no longer responds to the familiar levers of approval and disapproval, is experienced as a disruption. When the drawing back doesn't work, the interpretation shifts. Distant, cold, arrogant, thinks they're better than everyone else. These are the labels, and here is what makes them so effective. They carry just enough surface resemblance to something real that they're difficult to reject entirely. There are people who are distant because they are genuinely contemptuous. There are people who are quiet because they genuinely believe they're above the conversation. So when the label lands on you, when someone accuses you of the very things you know you aren't,